While traditional metaphysical idealism, the position that reality is fundamentally of a mental rather than a physical nature, has not often been defended in recent philosophy. This position nevertheless possesses a number of strengths when it comes to philosophical problems that challenge the materialistic worldview. As a result, it has seen increased interest over the past few decades, with some particularly thorough defenses of such positions. The two most significant of these are the British philosophers T.L.S. Sprigg, whose absolute idealism I've covered in another video, and John Forster, whose phenomenalistic idealism I will provide a relatively thorough overview of in this video. Forster defends a particular metaphysical idealist standpoint, which he terms Canonical Phenomenalistic Idealism. His work has been characterized by, quote, much careful and detailed analysis and complex arguments, end quote. And these arguments will be presented in what follows. Forster's point of departure is the question of the metaphysical status of the physical world. And he bases his defense of metaphysical idealism on a rejection of realism concerning this world. That is, a rejection of physical realism. His argumentation is rooted in the problem of perception of the external physical world, a problem I have also addressed in another video. He identifies two main and competing viewpoints: the fundamentalist view, which in practice corresponds to the theory of direct perception or direct realism, asserting that the perception of an object is psychologically fundamental, and the decompositional view, corresponding to representational perception theory, according to which the perception of an object is constituted by a state of consciousness that is not itself physically perceivable, along with certain additional external conditions, such as a causal relation to the object. However, if physical realism is assumed, both of these views must, according to Forster, be rejected. The first due to its lack of a satisfactory explanation of the connection between perceptual contact and the phenomenal content. Since this content is internal to consciousness, it cannot be equated with the sensible properties of external physical objects. The second, because when the subject's contact with the physical object is dissolved, the contact no longer seems to qualify as genuinely perceptual, meaning that this viewpoint also fails to explain how perceptual contact with mind-independent objects could be attained. This is a relatively traditional approach to the defense of metaphysical idealism. Since both possible conceptions of perception must be rejected, the only remaining and unappealing possibility is to conclude that we have no perceptual access to the physical world at all. Quote, the situation is looking awkward, end quote, as he notes. However, he continues, this is only the case if one insists on maintaining an assumption of realism concerning the physical world. This problem does not arise if one instead adopts an idealist perspective. These considerations do not in themselves constitute a decisive argument for such an idealist position, Forster concedes, but they nevertheless make it clear that, quote, there is an issue here that needs to be explored, end quote. The physical world, as we perceive it, consists of objects moving in a three-dimensional space, and a central element of perception, Forster points out, is that space and objects appear to us as external and as possessing intrinsic qualitative properties. He now addresses the question of what type of knowledge we can attain about this physical world. Regarding physical objects, we can directly acquire knowledge of their spatio-temporal and functional properties, but not of their intrinsic content, and a similar situation applies to physical space. We can attain direct knowledge of its geometrical structure, but not of its intrinsic nature, quote, of what the thing which has the relevant structure is like in itself, end quote. In both cases, we can only attempt to identify the intrinsic properties indirectly, and empirical investigation is thus in principle precluded from truly accessing these properties. Such investigations are limited to providing topic-neutral knowledge of the physical world, that is, knowledge of spatio-temporal and functional properties, as well as the geometrical structure of space, but not of qualitative features or intrinsic nature. In other words, not of what objects and space are in themselves. Not only are these qualitative aspects empirically inscrutable, but they are also conceptually inscrutable, as we, quote, in physical terms cannot describe or even conceive of what sort of thing it might be, end quote. With these points in place, Foster can now turn his attention fully to the view of realism concerning the physical world. Despite the problem of the inaccessibility of intrinsic content, it might initially seem that a view of physical realism can still be defended by rejecting the existence of intrinsic properties, that is, by claiming that a description of reality solely based on structures or relations is sufficient to explain our experience of the physical world, including the phenomenal aspects of this experience. Foster objects that under such a claim, it becomes possible to describe space through purely abstract description, which is highly problematic. If intrinsic properties are not acknowledged, there's no explanation of what underlies real physical space itself. Furthermore, Foster argues that due to the inaccessibility of intrinsic properties and even the impossibility of their description in physical terms, physics is compelled to treat physical particles merely as moving objects with causal powers and to describe them solely through their ability to affect other particles. However, he continues, this approach is inconsistent. It's not possible to characterize all existence purely in terms of their ability to affect other existence, which are themselves only characterized by their ability to affect yet others. In other words, existence must be characterized by intrinsic properties. Otherwise, the chain of characterization becomes circular, ultimately empty. Therefore, Foster summarizes, we have arrived at a remarkable, and he emphasizes highly significant result, quote, apart from the topic-neutral facts of structure and organization, facts that do not reveal the nature of the ontological domain to which they belong, the world has turned out to be, as we might put it, a know-not-what, end quote. He further notes that, quote, this outcome is likely to prompt surprise and it might also engender unease, end quote. He asks, quote, can we accept the new limits of the extent of our physical knowledge without having to abandon our belief in a physical world altogether, end quote. The physical realist position might again be defended by claiming that physical reality possesses intrinsic properties that are unknown to us, and perhaps even in principle unknowable, but which nevertheless give rise to the phenomenological aspects of perceptual existence. However, Foster argues that this defense is deeply problematic. If our knowledge of the physical world is limited to what can be empirically observed, then it is limited to topic-neutral knowledge of spatio-temporal and functional structures, without access to any intrinsic or qualitative features of the physical entities. This topic-neutral knowledge is necessary for constructing any physical theory, but it is also fundamentally inadequate for establishing the truth of physical realism. Why? Because it is fully consistent with the possibility that the external world is not truly spatial at all, that it only appears spatial due to the structure of experience. Consequently, Foster concludes that the kind of knowledge available to the physical realist is incapable of securing the metaphysical reality of physical space or of physical objects themselves. The realist's empirical foundation is thus insufficient to justify the very worldview it is meant to support. Furthermore, since our empirical knowledge tells us nothing about the intrinsic content of space as such, that is, of the medium in which the geometrical structure empirically accessible to us is realized, this knowledge is insufficient to determine whether such a space even truly exists, and thus whether the physical world has real existence. If a standpoint of physical realism is maintained, despite this difficult epistemic situation caused by the inaccessibility of intrinsic properties, it would consequently imply that perception must be regarded as an inexplicable phenomenon, and that knowledge of the intrinsic properties of the physical world and space, as well as the determination of whether space even exists, would in principle lie beyond human cognitive capabilities. These three problems for the physical realist position, Foster notes, quote, are serious, and I do not think that the realist has any satisfactory way of dealing with them, end quote. However, if one instead adopts an idealist perspective, this is not the case, he argues, and on this basis he introduces the standpoint of phenomenalistic idealism. An idealist position that, as he defines it, quote, takes the physical world to be something whose existence is constituted by facts about human sensory experience or by some richer complex of non-physical facts in which such experiential facts centrally feature, end quote. The physical world appears to be ordered in a particular relevant manner, what Foster refers to as, quote, a world-suggestive orderliness, end quote, meaning that the physical world is experienced as, quote, a world for us, end quote. Therefore, the organization of human sensory experience must be such that, in conjunction with other relevant factors, it accommodates this condition. This organization thus takes on a constitutive and thereby crucial role in the variant of phenomenalistic idealism that Foster advocates. He notes that, quote, as I see it, this position is the only version of phenomenalistic idealism with any prospect of success, end quote. And for this reason, he designates this variant as canonical idealism. The physical realist position, Foster continues, consists of two claims. One asserting that the physical world is ontologically independent of human consciousness, meaning that the existence of the physical world, though not necessarily its specific content, is logically independent of conditions in or concerning human consciousness. And another asserting that the physical world is something whose existence is philosophically fundamental, meaning that it cannot be reduced to anything else, whether analytically, conceptually, or constitutively, metaphysically. Phenomenalistic idealism, of course, stands in opposition of both of these claims and thereby avoids the major problems that physical realism faces. In a canonical idealist perspective, the aforementioned problem of perception does not arise, since, given that the underlying conditions organizing sensory experience are assigned decisive significance, perceptual experience does not need to reach beyond the boundaries of consciousness to establish an ontological connection with things in the world. The second problem, the impossibility of describing and understanding physical space and objects through topic-neutral knowledge, the only kind empirically accessible to us, is also avoided. This is partly because the phenomenal aspects of our experience, which must be discarded under the realist view, do not need to be discarded under the idealist view, and partly because, on an idealist perspective, there is simply no externally placed, empirically inaccessible content out there in a physical world. In a realist understanding, the physical world is metaphysically fundamental, and it must therefore necessarily contain all the conditions required for our experience of the world. However, this is not the case in an idealist understanding. Here, other constitutive conditions are present, and so idealism, unlike realism, does not suffer from the problem that the conditions for experience are not accessible within the reality that is proposed by the view to exist. Nor does the third problem, the impossibility of determining whether physical space exists, arise in an idealist understanding, since in contrast to the physically realist perspective, the physical world is not identified with an external reality, though it will become clear, Foster does incorporate a certain kind of external reality in his idealist view. Regarding all three of these issues, the idealist position is thus far stronger than the realist one. However, Foster argues that this alone is not sufficient for a definite rejection of realism. Instead, it must be demonstrated that the realist position has a weakness so significant that it cannot be sustained. While these issues serve to highlight areas where the realist standpoint has, as he puts it, quote, awkward consequences, end quote, which naturally weakens its plausibility, they are not, according to Foster, enough to demonstrate a truly, quote, fundamental flaw in the view itself, end quote. Such a demonstration is therefore required, leading him to begin his argument for the presence of such a fundamental flaw in the realist perspective, and actually, quote, refutation of realism, end quote. Foster's argumentation, which has been characterized as possessing a high degree of, quote, complexity and subtlety, end quote, targets the possibility of identifying the experienced physical world with the, according to the realist view, real physical world. He designates that part of the overall physical reality, which includes those conditions that are either physically fundamental or fully constituted by physically fundamental conditions, as the core physical reality. Correspondingly, something is a relevant external reality if and only if it meets the following criteria. Its essential nature is entirely logically independent of conditions related to human consciousness. The conditions within it are not constitutively reducible to conditions outside it, and it underlies the systematic organization of human sensory experience. In a physically realist perspective, the core physical reality must therefore be regarded as such a relevant external reality. It is possible to imagine scenarios in which the structure of the relevant external reality diverges from how it empirically appears, that is, from the physical world as it is experienced through sensory perception. Foster refers to a subset of such cases as cases of relevant deviance, in which the core physical reality and the relevant external reality cannot be identified with each other. In these cases, physical reality, as conceived, is structured according to empirical experience, but does not correspond to the actual structure realized in the external world. To illustrate this, Foster introduces a thought experiment, later known as the Oxbridge swap. Suppose the external reality is empirically indistinguishable from our own, except that two regions, R1 and R2 corresponding to Oxford and Cambridge, have swapped locations. The laws governing experience are configured so that everything appears spatially continuous. So when one drives from Oxford to Cambridge, the journey feels smooth and uninterrupted through Oxfordshire and Cambridgeshire, as expected. Yet in external reality, as soon as one leaves Oxford, R1, one's location instantaneously jumps to the region that appears to be adjacent, despite being spatially disconnected. A second jump then places the traveler in R2, Cambridge. As Foster puts it, quote, all the empirical evidence, past and future, actual and potential, from the most casual observation to the most searching experimental test, end quote, would indicate spatial continuity, even though the external structure is discontinuous. This shows that empirical experience and topic-neutral knowledge derived from it is consistent with multiple incompatible external configurations. If we were to determine the location of Oxford and Cambridge, a question fully accessible to empirical investigation, and every empirical test, without exception, provided a single definite answer, we would, in a certain sense, be obliged to accept that answer as logically final. If we were to allow for the possibility that this answer could be wrong, quote, we may be through and through belied by how things are disposed to present themselves empirically. We would lose our grip on what physical arrangement is. The physical world, to qualify as the physical world, as a world that forms the target of our ordinary physical beliefs, has to be our world, and it can only be our world in the relevant sense if it is ours empirically, if it is a world that is, as we might put it, empirically immanent, end quote. And thus, quote, our understanding of the nature of physical spatial arrangement cannot be separated from our ordinary ways of empirically assessing what forms of arrangement obtain. And so we need to think of the physical topology as conforming to the empirically projected topology rather than to the empirically hidden topology of the external reality, end quote. But this move undermines physical realism. If the physical world is identified with the empirical world, there can be no gap between appearance and reality, contradicting the realist view that the world exists independently of how it appears. In short, topic-neutral knowledge lacks the resources to justify physical realism because it cannot distinguish between different external realities that support the same empirical structure. One might object that this is merely a hypothetical scenario and not a reflection of how things actually are. Foster acknowledges that the thought experiment is somewhat unconventional, but he insists that the crucial point is that it is logically possible to conceive of it. It cannot be logically ruled out that this is actually the case and, quote, it would surely be awkward for the realist if his view of the world had to be, to some extent, speculative in this way. If its correctness had to depend on the outcome of some issue of fact, we cannot definitely settle. We surely expect realism as a philosophical thesis to be a response to our fundamental conception of the physical world, rather than to what we take to be the most plausible account of the specific circumstances of its existence, end quote. The realist might now attempt to salvage the position by asserting that physical realism indeed provides the correct account of how things are, or at least of what we are justified in taking them to be. However, Foster objects with what has been called his, quote, startling second key idea, end quote. Even if there were no relevant divisions between the empirical world and external reality, and the physical and external worlds were thus perfectly aligned in structure and organization, the two still could not be identified with each other. The situation is no different from the previous case. The physical world is identified with the world of empirical experience, that is, with the world as it appears, and not with external reality as it is in itself. The structure of the physical world is logically derived not from the structure of external reality in itself, but from the structure and organization of external reality, particular aspects of human consciousness, and any other factors that might be logically necessary for the existence of a physical world. Thus, the physical and external realities cannot be identified with each other, even if they were entirely identical in structure and organization, because the structure of the physical world, for it to be actual, logically depends on more than just the structure of external reality. The metaphysical foundation of the physical world is the ordering and nature of our sensory experience, not external reality as it is in itself, even if that reality were to align with our experience of it. And as Forrest now concludes, quote, "If realism cannot handle the case that represents its best scenario, it fails altogether." End quote. Forrest's argument against physical realism can now be summarized. The physical realist position faces three significant problems. Since the physical world is understood in this position as ontologically independent of human consciousness, there seems to be no satisfactory explanation for the perception of physical objects, as it remains unexplained how perceptual awareness can reach the objects in this world. Furthermore, the only knowledge we can obtain empirically about physical objects and physical space is topic-neutral knowledge, that is, knowledge of objects' spatio-temporal and functional properties and the geometric structure of space, but not of any qualitative aspects or intrinsic properties, meaning what objects and space are in themselves. And since these aspects cannot be explained or described in terms of physical concepts, they are not only empirically inaccessible, but also conceptually inaccessible. Thus, topic-neutral empirical knowledge is not, as required under a physical realist view, sufficient to provide an adequate understanding of physical space and the objects within it. Moreover, empirical knowledge does not even allow us to determine whether the external world is spatial or non-spatial, that is, whether a real external space exists at all, which is a crucial assumption in physical realism. These three problems place physical realism in a weak position, whereas conversely, canonical phenomenalistic idealism is in a stronger one, as it does not face any of these problems. However, Forrest does not find them sufficient in themselves to completely undermine realism. The decisive argument for rejecting physical realism, he argues, lies in the fact that we cannot identify the physical world with the actual external reality. For instance, we cannot determine in any way whether the external world could actually possess a continuity corresponding to the way the physical world spatially coheres, or whether it lacks such continuity, but simply operates under laws that in every situation make it appear to us as if it does. And the mere logical possibility of this scenario renders the realist perspective speculative, which is highly problematic. We must expect, he emphasizes, that physical realism as a philosophical thesis concerns our fundamental conception of the physical world as it is, and not merely what we take to be the most plausible description of particular circumstances of its existence. Even if it were the case that the external world actually corresponds to our empirical world, the physical world cannot be identified with the external world. It will always be identified with the empirical world, and the structure of the physical world logically depends on more than just the structure of external reality, including aspects of human cognitive apparatus. Thus, even in the case of full structural correspondence between the two, the foundation of the physical world is never the real external world. And the view of realism concerning the physical world can therefore, Foster concludes, be definitively rejected. Canonical phenomenalistic idealism, on the other hand, he emphasizes, can handle the situation, regardless of whether there is a deviation or a correspondence between the two worlds. According to this view, it is precisely the system governing human sensory experience that plays a decisive role, ensuring that there is systematically, quote, a world-suggestive pattern, end quote. In human consciousness, this creates, quote, the systematic appearance of a certain kind of world at the human empirical viewpoint, end quote. And thus, canonical idealism, quote, ensures the requisite empirical immanence of the physical world, end quote. The phenomenalist idealist perspective, however, stands in direct contradiction to our common and fundamental understanding of the ontological status of the physical world in relation to our consciousness. In the physical world, Foster acknowledges, human subjects are closely linked to biological organisms, their bodies, and there exists a complex functional relationship between the two. In such a situation, it seems impossible, even if human subjects were to be accepted as ontologically independent of the physical world, to conceive of the physical world as ontologically dependent on their minds, as required in an idealist perspective. This issue is particularly pronounced in the phenomenalistic idealist viewpoint, where the organization of sensory experience is attributed a constitutive role in the creation of the physical world, as it appears self-contradictory, since it is precisely the physical world that, according to common understanding, underlies sensory experience. However, Foster argues, quote, on closer scrutiny, this apparent problem for the idealist could be seen to be illusory, end quote. In the idealist understanding, there are two distinct levels at which the human subject and its conscious life exist: the mundane framework and the transcendental framework. In the latter framework, the question concerns the fundamental metaphysical nature of being and the view that consciousness centrally contributes to the creation of the physical world is upheld. That is, of course, a crucial point in an idealist perspective. However, within the former framework, that is, within the concretely manifest world that is thus constituted, human subjects and the physical world, quote, form interactive partners in an integrated psychophysical whole, end quote. Within this framework, the physical world is not seen as ontologically dependent on consciousness. The question of the ontological relation between consciousness and the physical world, Foster emphasizes, thus takes two different forms for the idealist. One where the focus is on investigating the fundamental metaphysical structure of reality, and one where the idealistically constituted psychophysical reality is examined. The answer to the question therefore depends on which framework is chosen as the context. On this basis, Foster rejects the claim that the idealist contradicts himself when he argues that the physical world is ontologically dependent on human consciousness. Another objection concerns the question of objectivity. Canonical idealism claims that it is the organization of sensory experience that makes things appear, quote, systematically worldwise, end quote. However, quote, it is hard to see how what, if anything, gets created could count as anything more than a virtual reality. It is hard to see how we could think of it as forming a genuine world, end quote. And, he adds, this problem represents the greatest challenge to the idealist position. Although the physical world does not have the same ontological status or independence from human consciousness as it does in the realist understanding, it nonetheless exists according to the canonical idealist position. And since the argumentation for this position has been conducted negatively through demonstration that the alternative physical realism is untenable, the idealist position could in principle be vulnerable to a similar refutation. If this were to occur, the only remaining possibility would be what Forrest calls physical nihilism, the total rejection of the existence and even the possibility of existence of any physical world at all. Thus Forrest emphasizes, quote, a great deal is at stake here, end quote. Not only because there would be nothing possessing both the empirical immanence required to constitute, quote, our world, end quote, and the objectivity required to be, quote, a real world, end quote, which would in itself be, quote, a very unpleasant outcome, end quote. But also because we would have no reason to trust that our sensory experience is in fact probably organized and structured, which is otherwise the cornerstone of canonical idealism. As a result, we would find ourselves, quote, not only bereft of our physical beliefs, but in an epistemic wilderness, end quote. A particular issue related to this concerns the ontological status of human consciousness. Here Forrest aligns himself with, quote, the common sense view, end quote, according to which the concrete elements of consciousness experience are understood as irreducible states and actions belonging to enduring conscious subjects. He thus rejects the Humean view, which denies the existence of a substantial subject in an ontological sense, and instead holds that the apparent subject's consciousness is merely a bundle of elements of conscious experience. However, Forrest does not base this rejection on the commonly raised argument against the Humean view, that it provides no satisfactory way to define the unity of consciousness, but rather on the claim that, quote, the very notion of subjective mentality is unintelligible, end quote. The presence of consciousness experience necessitates the existence of a subject in whose consciousness it appears. He elaborates, quote, thus, I can no more understand how there could be a thought without a thinker, a belief without a believer, or an experience without an experiencer, than I can understand how there could be speech without a speaker or motion without something that moves. End quote. Since consciousness, in an idealist perspective, plays a constitutive role in the creation of the physical world, its existence must be regarded as logically independent of this world. In this respect, there's an overlap with the Cartesian dualist perspective, though in the latter the physical world is still understood in a realist sense. However, as Forrest observes, quote, in the current philosophical scene, the Cartesian view of the human mind, as indeed any radically dualist view, is very unfashionable, end quote. And this perspective on consciousness is, quote, now standardly regarded as wholly discredited, end quote. The overwhelming majority of contemporary philosophers either adopt a fully physicalist understanding of consciousness, or at least take for granted that human subjects are, at least partially, physical and thus cannot be ontologically independent of the physical world. However, Forrest does not consider this to be a significant problem for the idealist position. Firstly, the opposition to the Cartesian view and to immaterialist conceptions of consciousness in general that has been prevalent over the past several decades has developed within a realist framework regarding the physical world and cannot be detached from it. Since physical realism has already been refuted earlier in his argument, this opposition can also be dismissed. Secondly, Foster argues that the Cartesian view of consciousness could be seen as correct even within a realist framework. Therefore, he concludes the Cartesian view of consciousness, that the existence of consciousness is logically independent of the physical world, which is necessary in an idealist understanding, can be maintained. In canonical idealism, as has been demonstrated, the organization of sensory experience plays a central role in the creation of the physical world. More precisely, quote, "The sensory organization is that system of control over the course of human sensory experience that disposes it to conform to its world suggestive pattern. And the way in which this contributes to the constitutive creation of the world is by disposing things to appear systematically worldwise at the human empirical viewpoint." End quote. However, the organization of sensory experience alone is not sufficient to provide the foundation for this creation. Certain relevant, quote, endowments of the human mind, end quote, also play a crucial role. These are, quote, endowments that make us empirically sensitive to the orderly character of our sensory experience and equip us to register its world suggestiveness, end quote, including, quote, a natural doxastic bias in favor of regularity, end quote. That is, the human mind is fundamentally structured to seek and recognize patterns, thereby enabling us to experience living in a world that appears genuine to us. Additionally, another factor plays a decisive role, particularly in ensuring that the objectivity of this world is maintained. The idealist rejects the notion that the physical world is metaphysically fundamental, but, quote, even so, the idealist is still at liberty, in his account of what is metaphysically fundamental, to suppose that there is some form of external reality that causally controls the course of human sensory experience, and is thereby responsible for the sensory organization, end quote. Such an external reality whose influence contributes an independent constitutive element to the idealist creation of the world could provide, quote, a sort of objective underpinning to the world suggestive way in which things are disposed to empirically appear. An underpinning that renders this system of appearance in some sense objectively appropriate, end quote. This aspect of objectivity is of critical importance, Foster emphasizes. If the idealist created world is to be more than merely, quote, a virtual reality, end quote, and if physical nihilism is to be avoided. One option is that this external reality, which governs our sensory experiences, is a reality whose structure and organization precisely match the world in which we have empirical access. Since the way things appear to us would then be a reflection of how they actually are in external reality, such a situation might seem to provide the desired objective grounding. Quote, certainly, quote, Foster remarks, I used to think it adequate myself, end quote. But upon closer examination, he says, it turns out to be that this is not the case. The initial plausibility of the idea, Foster argues, is, at least in part, merely because our intuitive assessment is to some extent influenced by our habitual way of thinking. A way of thinking rooted in a physical realist viewpoint. The plausibility of this option is thus simply due to its resemblance to the realist conception. The assertion of this type of external reality cannot provide the required objective grounding. If the structure and organization of external reality align with that of the experienced world, then the system would indeed possess, quote, a kind of objective underpinning, end quote. The way things appear to us would also be the way they externally are. However, such an underpinning based on the authenticity of external conditions would be, quote, an objective underpinning of a realist kind, end quote. Foster objects that there is no reason to think that such a correspondence with or adaptation to external reality could contribute to enabling the system to idealistically create a new reality that mirrors or conforms to it. That is, there's nothing to indicate that such a correspondence could provide something that allows the way things are disposed to appear to us to also be the way they actually are. Verification through correspondence with external reality therefore does not, in an idealist context, explain why the world as created should possess sufficient objectivity to qualify as a genuinely real world. Furthermore, he continues, one could also imagine that external reality does not precisely match the manifest world, but only functionally aligns with it. This would offer the idealist a range of new possibilities regarding proposals for the nature of the idealist world. However, Foster argues, these scenarios would also be subject to the aforementioned objection. Quote, no kind of preservation of the character of the external situation in how things are disposed to empirically appear at the human viewpoint could assist the system of appearance in its role as world creative. End quote. In an idealist context, this system, the system of empirical appearance, does not serve the function of delivering a representation of the external world, as is the case in a realist context, but instead plays a central role in the idealist creation of a kind of new world. However, the issues arising from this problem do not entail that the idea of an external reality should be rejected, Foster asserts. On the contrary, the problem of sufficient and appropriately structured objective support can be resolved through the theistic approach. This approach involves, quote, ascribing the ultimate responsibility for the sensory organization to God and taking the fact of God's responsibility in the context of the purposes that underlie it to be what provides the right kind of objective underpinning for how things are disposed to empirically appear. End quote. Foster thus develops a variant of idealism that in many ways resembles Berkeley's, with God as the decisive factor. Whether God indirectly governs how sensory experience unfolds by creating an external, mechanically operative reality that brings about sensory experience, or does so directly through continuous action, the required objective underpinning is ensured. Quote, what logically sustains the existence of the world is not the world-suggestive system of appearance on its own, but this system as ordained and authorized by God. End quote. Instead of merely describing or reflecting external reality, the system is thus assigned a normative status, quote, as how things objectively ought to be disposed to empirically appear to us, end quote. Since it is God's will or part of His plan that we should experience and feel as though we inhabit, quote, a world for us, end quote. In such a situation would, quote, God's authorization of the system succeed in giving it the right kind of objective underpinning that measures up to what is idealistically needed. End quote. Foster's conclusion regarding his investigation into the metaphysical nature of the world, his central metaphysical thesis, is therefore that, quote, the world is something whose existence is constitutively sustained by three factors. First, the sensory organization, which disposes sensory experience to conform to its world-suggestive pattern. Second, the relevant endowments of the human mind, which makes us empirically receptive to the orderly character of our sensory experiences, and thereby enable the sensory organization to dispose things to appear systematically world-wise at our empirical viewpoint. Third, the ordaining role of God, which provides the right kind of objective underpinning for the way in which things are disposed to appear empirically." End quote. Foster unquestionably, quote, "wends an intricate argumentative path," end quote, and, quote, "at each stage of his argument a host of interesting objections and difficulties could be raised," end quote. The objections that have been advanced against Foster's argumentation and precision fall into several main categories. A perception-theoretic critique arguing that his rejection of causal theories, that is, representative realism, is unconvincing. A challenge to the argument about the inaccessibility of intrinsic content. A problematization of what we understand by the concept of the physical world, and thereby of the argument for rejecting physical realism based on the logical possibility that external real space, if it exists, is fundamentally different from our experience of it. A claim that he provides a merely superficial treatment of the element central to his metaphysics, the organization of sensory experience. An objection regarding a, quote, "somewhat obscure," end quote, "and unconvincing argument for why correspondence with external reality as a condition for an organizer of sensory experience cannot serve as the bias for the required objective support. And, not least, significant criticism of the inclusion of God as a guarantor of this objectivity. This inclusion of God must be regarded as the most controversial element of Foster's already, in many respects, controversial thesis in relation to prevailing views in contemporary philosophical debate. One reviewer thus concludes that, quote, "if the Oxbridge swap argument succeeds, there is a compelling case for law-governed canonical idealism, though it does not follow that there is a case for theism," end quote. Thus, Foster's view is challenged on multiple fronts. However, it addresses important epistemological and ontological issues and is therefore of philosophical interest. While it contains fewer normative elements than Sprigg's absolute idealist metaphysics, the rejection of a materialist and even physically realist metaphysics, with all the implications this entails, is nonetheless also existentially quite significant. Thanks.